write about this. I don't even want to do the article we came here to do. The whole thing just feels unfortunate and embarrassing. So I came a long way in the 2 years. We had managed to put together and publish a story in the New Yorker magazine about migrant crisis we had gone to cover, and I think was very important and consequential and powerful. But from the first time I had heard Lucy's end of the story, where she had been in Washington, in my newspaper man's heart, I knew that was a good story and a rare story. But Lucy and I had also, for any number of years, wanted to do a project together. And it came to feel like, oh, well, this could be that.
What was it like to do it?
Well, I had to persuade Lucy first. I think she had some reservations about, like, what, who would be interested in this? But I think I encouraged her to trust me. And we both wrote our parts by ourselves, distinctive, and we didn't really share them in advance in any way, or this is what I've got so far. And I think that was a neat experience.
Joe is correct in saying that I was like fairly reluctant. So I just wasn't sure how much juice I had to give, and I don't want to feel like I'm capitalizing on this. But then to a certain extent, I think what got me was maybe Joe wants the opportunity to share or communicate or write this story out. And maybe doing it together could be a way of me, I don't know, being some kind of emotional support in addition to a work buddy. I think the thing that I go to is I imagine 30 years down the road taking stock of our relationship, even if this is the one thing that we work on together. I think it'll feel pretty important and special to be able to say, like, me and my dad had this great of a relationship that we could write and tell our story together and be totally honest about it with each other. And you know, I couldn't imagine letting someone else write that story for us. And so I guess I got an even deeper appreciation of the role that journalists and nonfiction storytellers have. And I love my dad's writing. I love reading everything he has to write, even when it's difficult details of what captivity is like, and it took special, not joy, but appreciation reading it.
I said to Lucy throughout the process that I wanted the story to feel like it was her story to tell. And once it was out in the world and it was published, and being a lifelong vainglorious reporter who loved nothing more than to have his byline on the front page of the New York Times and have everyone tell you how great you are and how moved they were, every single response that I've gotten to the piece has basically been, what an amazing child you have. And even though it hurts me somewhere about, hey, what about me? Didn't I write it well? You know, that has been the most satisfying thing. What an amazing child you have. And how right they are.
Storytellers Joe and Lucy Sexton. You can read the article they wrote together in The Atavist. It's called Held Together. That's it for today. We'll be back with more Outlook tomorrow. I'm Aussie Fuchs. Thanks for listening.
This is the BBC World Service, and you're listening to Witness History with me, Ashley Byrne. Today I'm taking you back to 1974, when a revolutionary new first aid technique that would go on to save countless people from choking to death was first developed. I've been speaking to Janet Heimlich, daughter of Dr. Henry Heimlich, about the development of the Heimlich manoeuvre.
Just feel the soft part just underneath your ribs here, and put one hand into that soft part here with her bending over slightly, hold the first hand and pull inwards and upwards.
This procedure was so simple that he started to hear about cases where very young children would save their very young siblings or save a parent.
Below the lungs and below the diaphragm to force air out of the lungs and up through the airway. And we hope that it will take the obstruction with it.
Born in the US state of Delaware in 1920 and raised in New York, Janet says her father was inspired to become a physician at a very early age.
He knew from the age of 3 that he wanted to be a doctor. One of the people who really inspired him actually was the physician who came to people's homes. That was his first exposure to someone working in the medical field.
And it's while studying to become a physician that Henry saved his first life.
He was 19 and he was on a train heading through New York State. The train jumped off the tracks and went into a large pond. One of the people who worked on the train was killed. The other man was trapped under the train in the water, and my father jumped in the water and just held the man up above water so he could breathe until help finally came.
After graduating from medical school in December 1943 during the Second World War, the now Dr. Heimlich enlisted in the US Navy and was posted to a mobile medical unit in the Gobi Desert in Inner Mongolia. As well as taking care of the American and Chinese soldiers stationed there, he adapted a treatment for the eye disease trachoma and also got the idea for a life-saving device.
My father, of course, is best known for having invented the Heimlich maneuver, but he did come up with some other life-saving procedures. He did lose one soldier who had been shot in the chest, and because of his lung collapsing, the man died. And my father, years later, he came up with an invention called the Heimlich chest drain valve. If someone was shot on the battlefield, the guy's fellow soldier could just put it in the wound and allow the lung to fill up so that the person could continue to breathe and survive.
Where did the idea for the maneuver come from?
It started with my father sitting at the kitchen table reading the New York Times, where he learned that thousands of people were choking to death every year. He had a laboratory area that he could work in at the hospital where he was a physician, and he anesthetized dogs as a way to experiment. And he would lodge a tube in the throat. When the breathing stopped, he would try pushing on the body in different places. Of course, he would, revive the dog immediately if something wasn't working. But the idea was to use air that was still left in the lungs. So he was thinking that this residual air could be the key to forcing the object out. But what he found was when he was pushing on the chest or the back, it didn't do anything. So then he wondered about forcing it out from below the lungs and under the diaphragm. He pushed below that area and the tube came flying out of the dog's mouth. And this happened 100% without exception. And so he came up with 5 simple steps that a person would use. So you would stand behind the victim, reach around the person's waist with both arms. You would make a fist with one hand, cover your fist with the other, and then push in and up. And that is what forces that air up and shoots an object out of the mouth.
By 1974, after about a year of research, Dr. Heimlich would write about his findings in the medical journal Emergency Medicine in an article called Pop Goes the Cafe Coronary. And I gather, Janet, that right at the very beginning, it wasn't known as the Heimlich maneuver.
A lot of times people refer to choking, since it often happened in restaurants, as a cafe coronary. Of course, it's not a coronary. And at that time, it didn't have the name Heimlich maneuver. He hadn't named it anything. But then when it was published in the same journal, but at a later time, the editors felt like it needed a name. So they asked him what he would want to call it, and he wasn't sure. And they said, we were thinking of either Heimlich method or Heimlich maneuver, and he felt Heimlich maneuver was the right name.
Shortly after Dr. Heimlich's article, the Chicago Daily News published a story about this new method of saving people from choking. Janet was just 12 at the time, but remembers the first time someone's life was saved as a result of her father's work.
The very first save that was ever recorded It was a retired restaurateur, a guy who had seen many people choke in his restaurant. He was on vacation, and after he read this one column, he heard a man yelling. He ran over to his cabin, and the man's wife was slumped over her food. The restaurateur just jumped up, he remembered what he had read, and he saved her life. At that point, it took off like wildfire.
Do you remember personally your dad talking about any of this at that time?
No, because I was away at sleepaway camp. Our camp counselor came up to me and showed me an article and said, look, your dad has invented this. It's a way to save people from choking. My dad had come up with other things, you know, he had been in the paper. To me, I didn't quite get it. It didn't seem like any big deal. And then it wasn't until I came back that it almost overtook our lives.
After more than 40 years of advocating the use of his manoeuvre, Dr. Henry Heimlich died in December 2016 at the age of 96. But it was only 6 months before his death that he used his namesake manoeuvre to save someone himself for the very first time.
She was sitting in a chair, and I turned her around so that her back would be exposed to me. Put my arms around her and pressed where I described it on the abdomen below the rib cage. And after 3 compressions, this piece of meat came out and she just started breathing.
I ordered a hamburger, and the next thing I know, I couldn't breathe. I was choking so hard. And that's Dr. Heimlich next to me. So he did the Heimlich maneuver.
And when I asked him later about it, you know, what happened and what was it like for you, you know, he just talked about it as if he was putting on someone's Band-Aid.
Did he ever think how many people may have actually been saved by doing the Heimlich maneuver?
I don't know if my father was so aware of how many people around the world were learning it and performing it and so forth, but he would get sent photographs of children who had been saved with the Heimlich maneuver or had saved someone else. This was so exciting to him. He had a wall just kind of covered with photos of these kids in his office and just felt so proud about that.
Janet Heimlich was speaking to me, Ashley Byrne, for this edition of Witness History. It was a Made in Manchester Worker Bee co-production for the BBC World Service.
You're listening to the BBC World Service.
Documentaries, telling the stories that shape us and our world.
I had not expected that this investigation was going to be so difficult for me.
Would I be able to get out of Afghanistan safe? Would not any member of the Taliban recognize me?
Documentaries on the BBC World Service at bbcworldservice.com/documentaries or wherever you get your BBC podcasts. In 30 minutes, Hollywood Exiles.
I'm Una Chaplin, and I want to know how so many people were kicked out of Hollywood for their political beliefs. This week, my grandfather is among 19 people summoned before Congress to answer questions about so-called un-American activities.
The newsroom is next. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Emergency teams in the US suspend the search for 6 construction workers after a major bridge collapsed in Baltimore.
We do not believe that we're going to find any of these individuals still alive, and so we are going to suspend the active search and rescue efforts.
This is Andrew Peach in London. Also in the newsroom, the US Defense Secretary reiterates Washington's message to Israel that the number of casualties in Gaza is too high. NBC News drops a former chair of the Republican National Committee as a contributor after criticism from staff. Women in New York are encouraged to be vigilant after a spate of attacks.
I was
walking out of the Times Square station, and a random man came up and punched me in the head.
I was like walking out of class, sending a text to a friend, and then just got clocked in the face.
And China buys the technology that could lead to flying cars. Those stories on the way. It's now 4 hours GMT. Hello, I'm Chris Barrow with the BBC News. The US Coast Guard says 6 people still missing after a container ship brought down a major bridge in the city of Baltimore are now presumed dead. Rear Admiral Shannon Gilreath said it was unlikely the construction workers were alive because of the length of time they've been missing and low water temperatures. The Singapore Port Authority says the ship, which was flagged in the city-state, passed 2 inspections last year. Meanwhile, the US Transportation Secretary, Pete Buttigieg, has said that Francis Scott Key Bridge will in time be rebuilt.
This is one of the cathedrals of American infrastructure. It has been part of the skyline of this region for longer than many of us have been alive. So the path to normalcy will not be easy. It will not be quick. It will not be inexpensive.
The Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has sought to cool recent tensions with Washington, saying that he'd stressed the importance of US-Israeli ties during talks with his US counterpart Lloyd Austin. Speaking in Washington, Mr. Gallant said his country shared 100% of the values of the US and 99% of the interests. Earlier, Mr. Austin reiterated Washington's message to Israel that the number of civilian casualties in Gaza is far too high. France and Brazil have announced an investment program worth $1.1 billion aimed at protecting the Amazon rainforest. It was unveiled in the Brazilian city of Belém by the visiting French President Emmanuel Macron alongside his Brazilian counterpart Lula da Silva. Here's Jason Lee.
Regarded as the gateway to the lower Amazon region, Belém will host next year's UN Climate Summit, so it was rather fitting that such funding to protect the environment was launched in the city. The program proposes the creation of a carbon market that will reward countries investing in natural carbon sinks like the Amazon rainforest. The agreement also includes support for indigenous people living in the world's largest rainforest. The 2 leaders said they hope the program will serve as a global roadmap for the protection of tropical forests, which play a key role in the fight against climate change.
The independent US presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has announced a Silicon Valley lawyer and philanthropist, Nicole Shanahan, as his running mate. She's the former wife of the Google co-founder Sergey Brin and has never run for office before. But Mr. Kennedy, an anti-vaccine activist and nephew of John F. Kennedy, praised Ms. Shanahan as a gifted administrator and said she had other qualities too.
I wanted someone with a spiritual dimension and compassion and idealism, and above all, a deep love of the United States of America.
Robert F. Kennedy's anti-establishment campaign has worried Democrats who are concerned he could take votes from President Biden. World news from the BBC. The lawyer of the American rapper Sean Diddy Combs has criticized Monday's raids on his properties by US federal agents as a gross overuse of military-level force. The lawyer dismissed media speculation that his client had been arrested and described as meritless the accusations of his involvement in sex trafficking. Thousands of Hungarians have demonstrated in Budapest demanding the resignation of Prime Minister Viktor Orbán after a formal official released a recording allegedly implicating ministers in a corruption scandal. Peter Magyar has handed over what he says is a secretly recorded phone call he had with his ex-wife, the then Justice Minister, in which she seemed to confirm that government figures tampered with prosecution files. Mr. Magyar addressed demonstrators at the rally.
Within just a few weeks, our country has plunged into the greatest political, moral, and legal crisis it's seen in recent years. Nothing can go on the way it was before. Let's tell the ruling power that the government must look into the eyes of the people and take political and legal responsibility for the mistakes that they've made, and even more so for the sins that they've committed.
The government says there's no case to answer. A European firm which built and successfully flew a flying car has sold the tech which powered it to a Chinese company. The air car can unfold a set of wings in the space of 2 minutes. In 2021, it flew for 35 minutes between two airports in Slovakia, driving on and off the runway at either end. Dachshunds, also known as sausage dogs, could be banned in Germany under a new law that would prohibit breeding practices inflicting long-term suffering on the animals. Dachshunds are prone to spinal problems linked to their short legs and long backs, but the German Kennel Club has launched a petition to save what they called our favourite dogs. BBC News. This is Andrew Peach on the BBC World Service. Good to have you with us here in the newsroom. The footage is pretty dramatic. A bulky container ship in the American city of Baltimore bumps into a slender bridge which then instantly collapses. Here's how it was captured on police radio in the city.
There's a ship approaching it, just lost their steering. So they're telling you, under control, we got to stop all traffic. There's a crew up there. You might want to notify whoever the foreman is, see if we can get them off the bridge temporarily.
C-13 dispatch, the whole bridge just fell down. Start, whoever, everybody. The whole bridge just collapsed.
Officials now say 6 missing construction workers who were on the bridge at the time are presumed to have died. The search and rescue